Is Donovan Wilson the most underrated Dallas Cowboy heading into the 2023 season? All that and more this episode of the Locked On Cowboys podcast.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your
Locked
daily Dallas Cowboys podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked on. Locked on. Locked on Cowboys.
Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. I am your host, Markquese Mosier. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosier. Joining me today, as always, is Landon McCool. You can check him out on Twitter at McCoolBCB. We are continuing with our preview series, getting you ready for Dallas Cowboys training camp later this month. We have finally got to the safety position, which is arguably the best position on the roster. We're going to get into all the names here and whether this is the best trio of safeties in the league. But Landon, I wanted to start with this. I think Donovan Wilson is the most underrated player on the Cowboys for a variety of reasons, which we can get into in a second. But would you agree with that statement?
I think he is certainly, at the top of the list, right? Because he is such a catalyst for this defense. He is a true playmaker. I think you would probably describe Kearse and Hooker as very safe safeties. That they keep it all in front of them. Like yeah, I mean, just what are you gonna do? They are playmakers too at their own right, for sure. But I would say, as far as the guy who, when you need a big play from the safety position, really not even just to the safety position, he is one of the true playmakers on this defense. He spent an early part of his career kind of being a very boom or bust type player, right? Like he felt like he was giving up some big plays while he was making some big plays. And I think a lot like we've seen from Trayvon Diggs, what we've seen is kind of, instead of it being such a wide boom and bust area, he's really raised his floor a bit and played very solid football and not making as many huge mistakes. But I think he's still maintained a high level of playmaking. So I think that he certainly needs to be the first person on that list, simply because there's two other guys in the position who also kind of take away a little bit of the luster from him. And in general, I just think that it's underrated how he continually makes huge game-changing plays right when the Cowboys defense needs it.
I saw the stat earlier this morning, kind of doing some research. He led all safeties in QB pressures, QB hits, run stops last year. And it just feels like we don't really talk about him as one of the top players in the defense. And that happens when you have a Micah Parsons and Trayvon Diggs and DeMarcus Lawrence. Like I get it. But you want to talk about like somebody who kind of brings the energy up of this defense and kind of makes his presence known in big games. Go watch the Giants game, the Monday Night Football game. He was phenomenal. He was all over the field. You could just feel, you could feel his energy, for a lack of a better term. When he's on the field, there's just a different type of intensity that the defense has.
He pulls the trigger and comes downhill as well as any safety in the league, and has great instincts and sees it all very well. He understands often what's happening to him and sees it early, and that's how he kind of is able to make those type of plays. I think because, again, he plays with two other guys who obviously play a ton of football. I mean, it's not like any one of these three safeties doesn't play a ton of snaps on this team. They all play a bunch. So I can see why it's easy to kind of, look past him a little bit, because most teams only have one good safety and the Cowboys have three probably average or better safeties. And Wilson obviously being the one that kind of generates the most big plays. It does feel like he gets overlooked sometimes as like the rotational guy instead of the extremely valuable box safety that can kind of do a little bit of everything for the Cowboys.
Well, it's why I thought it was such a big deal that the Cowboys were able to sign him to a contract extension this offseason, just because he fills so many roles, right? We've been worried about this linebacker spot for a while because there's only one established guy in Leighton Vander Esch, and he gets banged up a lot. But having somebody like Donovan Wilson who can come in and be your nickel linebacker, or frankly, just be your second linebacker if you need him to, he does everything so well. I've got the numbers here. These are from Pro Football Focus over the last 3 years. 73rd percentile coverage grade, 92nd percentile coverage grade with no pressure, 92nd percentile coverage grade on passes that come before 3 seconds, 61st percentile coverage grade at free safety, 70th percentile coverage grade in the box, 91st percentile forced incompletion rate, run defense grade, 70th percentile, run stop percentage, 99th percentile. I mean, he just does everything at an above average level. But when you talk about like the top 10, top 12 safeties in the NFL, he's never mentioned in that same tier, which is kind of strange to me.
Yeah, it was, not an overly drafted guy, was a guy that kind of developed inside the Cowboys, organization for years and years. And I think that because of that, I mean, that's usually the path that gets overlooked, right? It's the guys that aren't the first round picks that kind of develop and hone their craft over a series of years. And I think what you're seeing in Donovan Wilson now is kind of the end result of a very toolsy guy that came out of Texas A&M that just has over time stuck on the roster, continually got better. And suddenly you look around and you've got 2 free agent safeties that you bring into the organization. And the guy that you've been developing this whole time ends up being every bit, if not better than them. So I think it shows you just kind of the kind of a unique path that he took, and that it's not, the normal kind of flashy path that gets a lot of praise, but his play speaks for itself. And when he's on the field, offenses definitely feel it.
And the last thing I'm going to say on Wilson before we move on is going into year 5 with the team, right? 3rd year in Dan Quinn's defense. I think this is going to happen with a lot of these guys. Like when you get to year 3 of being in the same scheme and you basically know everything you need to know, you can just play really fast. Like you don't have to think. It's going to become second nature. I won't be surprised if we get, 3, 4, 5 players that have the best years of their career just simply because of continuity, right? Like that's one of the things that we don't talk about enough is like having the same system, being on the same team with the same defensive coach. That stuff really does matter when it comes to the big games. And now you just don't have to think.
Yeah, I mean, look, even if the team is kind of adjusting what they do, and that's been clear that defenses across the NFL are kind of moving more towards shell type coverage and stuff, and that even affected the Cowboys last year. They did that too. But just the mere fact that they are inside the defense with the same language and all that is changed. The checks are the same. All that is something that that's second nature to them. It's not something they have to relearn or re-go through. I mean, they will review it in training camp, but it's not something they're having to kind of ingest into themselves, and they know it all. It's second nature.
Because now Dan Quinn can go to Donovan Wilson and be like, hey, do you remember that game in 2021 when we played Patrick Mahomes in Kansas City and we ran this coverage on 3rd down? Like that kind of stuff is going to matter when you get into big time games.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that, and I think if they wanted to continue to make changes or continue to adjust what the type of coverage is, having that shorthand to be able to like talk about the situation in the language that you're going to use is helpful, right? It's easier to kind of have the conversation. Hey, we'll run this Dallas dog defense, except I want you to be 5 yards off the line of scrimmage instead of 7 yards to kind of watch for crossers. It's just like that sort of stuff. So I do think that it's going to benefit a lot of these players, but you're right. I think the secondary players specifically having, because of all the communication that's involved, because you have all these guys that have been here before, and the only person you're adding is a very savvy veteran. I feel like the communication is going to be incredibly solid on the back end for the Cowboys this year.
Donovan Wilson might be the most underrated player in the Cowboys, but is he even the best safety on the roster? We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting Major League Baseball on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. All you have to do is bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That is $200 you can spend on anything from betting on money lines to over-unders to who you think is going to get the first home run in the game, all on an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. There is no better place to bet on Major League Baseball than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That is FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, the official partner of Major League Baseball. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. We are continuing with our safety preview for the 2023 season. Landon, the Cowboys have two other safeties on the roster opposite of Donovan Wilson that both played over 1,000 snaps last year, Jayron, Kearse, and Malik Hooker. Of those three safeties, which one do you consider the best?
Well, it's funny because when you asked if Donovan Wilson was the most underrated player on this team, I part of me had to hold back because I do think that Malik Hooker does not get enough credit for what he does on this roster. I tend to think that Hooker may be the best of the three, simply because of his skill set is so much more versatile than everybody else's. I mean, I think Donovan Wilson can give you a little bit of everything, but you are getting the best Donovan Wilson when he's in the box, right? When he's able to come down and come downhill like we talked about and be aggressive. That's Donovan Wilson had his best. I think Malik Hooker is probably, I don't think there's a probably about it. I think Malik Hooker is the most skilled traditional safety, right? As far as what you would normally be traditionally asking a safety to do, I think he can do a little bit of everything better than all the rest of us, specifically playing on the back end. He's the best of these three at playing free safety, at kind of covering up everything and making sure everything stays in front of him. Having a guy like Malik Hooker is so incredibly valuable on this defense because it's all hinged and built around preventing big plays. Exactly. So you need to make sure that you have a safety who is keeping a conscious eye on what's happening behind or what's about to get past him and what's happening on the deep end, but athletic enough that they are able to do it while still being able to come downfield quickly if it's a short pass or a run. And that's a difficult level of athleticism. It's a difficult level of football IQ. You have to be able to understand, reading patterns and understanding, passing concepts and understand what they're trying to do to you and understand that you're being manipulated often by the quarterback and the offense. So having someone like Malik Hooker who, came into the league with a high level of pedigree, obviously had a very up and down career because of injuries in Indianapolis, and to see him like finally kind of put it all together, have multiple healthy seasons kind of rolled together, which allowed him to kind of take his game where it needed to go. And now I think you're starting to see the Malik Hooker we were promised, coming out of Ohio State. But I also think that he's not getting nearly the rah-rah that we saw early in his career when there was a lot of excitement. I think Malik Hooker allows this defense to do a lot of things that it absolutely would not be able to do without a solid, athletic, steady presence on the back end like Malik Hooker to kind of make sure that it's safe and not something that's going to get them burnt on the back.
Well, and I think Dan Quinn knows that. Look at like his track record as a defensive coordinator or as a head coach. Like he's always had to have that free safety that could make plays when needed and tackle, whether it was, Markquese in Atlanta kind of during his prime, whether it was Earl Thomas in Seattle, or even you go back to his Florida days when they had Matt Elam was a safety there, or back to the Jets when it was Kerry Rhodes, like in the mid 2000s, like that safety position, the true free safety that can cover a lot of ground and not give up big plays is really the whole goal of this defense,
pivotal,
as you mentioned.
Pivotal
right?
to a cover 1, cover 3 defense.
Because
you need that guy in the middle of the field,
Because the idea is that if you're going to beat us, you're going to have to do it on 12, 13 plays. And eventually you're going to mess up somewhere. You're going to have a penalty. You're going to take a sack. You're going to have a drop pass. As long as we don't give up the big plays, we're going to force something underneath. And having somebody like Malik Hooker has really helped the Cowboys in that department.
Yeah, and even as, like we've said, there is more of a shift away from the cover 1, cover 3 defenses. That doesn't mean that someone like Hooker is any less valuable, right? Because you're still going to play those coverages, and you're still going to need that guy in the middle of the field when you do. And then
when you play cover 2, he's going to dominate in cover 2.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh,
yeah.
And I was just going to
say area to cover.
I was going to say, if you're making his job easier if you're playing in cover 2, because that, like you said, like half the field, which is way less he's having to cover. He's easier to pull the trigger down if he needs to come down and make a hit. And that's the other thing too, is that you've got 2 safeties, you got 3 safeties who you have no problem making tackles, and that's a huge thing that you need with safety, especially nowadays, is they have got to be able to be physical enough to bring down tight ends and running backs that are coming out of the backfield. So all 3 of these guys definitely have that ability.
I've got two more questions about this three-headed monster. The first one is Jayron Kearse played through a ton of injuries last
Yeah.
year. A really important part of this defense because of his size, his length, his tackling ability. But I think he's over the age of 30 now. He has, pretty extensive injury history. Should we be worried about his play potentially falling off this year?
We're getting there. He turns 30 this year, I think. Yeah,
Okay.
he's 29 now and will be 30. So yeah, it's definitely, right near the area you start to worry about it. I think the other thing to keep in mind though is that he had a late blooming career. So he didn't put a ton of snaps on his body earlier on his career. It was mostly special team snaps, which are still snaps, but it's
Violent
not
snaps, though.
yeah, it's not like 1,000, snaps, per
Yeah,
season
sure.
previous to this. So maybe you get a little bit more longevity, but yeah, I do think it's time to start, considering what you've got in some of these other replacements and guys that we'll talk about here in a bit.
Or just limited snaps. Like,
yeah,
I love Jayron Kearse, but they probably don't need him to play 1,100 snaps this year. Maybe just cut 15 snaps out of him, game. And whether you give it to Mukamu or somebody else on the roster, it probably would help him stay a little bit fresher by the time you got to the playoffs.
Well, and the other, obviously benefit you get is that it gives you opportunity to develop those guys too. I mean, the good news for the Cowboys is that they have other guys on the roster that not only they feel like are competent, replacements for these guys, but they're guys that they want to have on the field to see them develop a little bit because they are the future at the position.
Yeah. Last question here before we move on. Is this the best safety room in the NFL?
I mean, it's got to be in the conversation, right? Like, listen, I saw that PFF graphic that came out this weekend, and the
I
word
had nothing to do with it. Don't worry.
Dave Hellman said it best, I think, when he said the word secondary is doing a lot of work for basically what the graphic said, just for those who didn't see, is that PFF listed a couple of different position groups, very oddly grouped, but they had one called secondary that they listed the Eagles as the best in the NFC at, which
very debatable.
I would say extremely debatable.
We'll have a little meeting at PFF.
That's another podcast, I guess. But I think to answer the larger question, like, look, I mean, top to bottom, there's no doubt in my mind, right? Like, if you want to have a conversation about some of the starters versus our starters, okay, we can have a conversation about that. But as far as like depth or, the number of safeties that has, or the versatility of what those guys can do, the Cowboys have the most depth, the most versatility at the position in the NFL as far as I'm concerned.
The only thing they don't have is the all-pro player at the top of the list. But as we've already mentioned, I think Donovan Wilson is a top 10 safety in the league. And I think with another season like he had last year, he's going to get some Pro Bowl consideration. And we know Malik Hooker is a first-round talent that played really well. I think it's the best unit in the NFL for my money, because you've got three guys that could be starters on every single team in the league.
Yeah.
And you've got two guys kind of behind them that are really talented options. So I
probably be starters too, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe they have one player in the top 10 safeties list, if you were ranking them, but they probably have three players in the top 15.
Exactly.
Right?
That's
like, so,
point,
and and ultimately we talk about secondary being a lot like offensive line, where it's great to have top end players, but what it's really about is your weak link, right?
It's
like,
a weak
that's
link position.
Weak link positions are defensive backfield and offensive line. The Cowboys have strength throughout at corner and safety. They have I think the Cowboys have the best secondary in football. I don't think it's a reach to say that at all.
All right, so we talked about the top three here for the Dallas Cowboys, but who is the deep sleeper that you are the most excited about this season? We'll get to that next. We want to thank you for making Locked On Cowboys your first listen every day. Every dayers. We'll be back for tomorrow's show answering your Twitter questions, so make sure you send them in to us at Markquese_Mosher, at McCoolBCB. But right now, we're talking about the deep sleepers at the safety position. Landon, who do you have your eye on as we go into training camp?
Well, I mean, it's hard not to immediately go to Israel Mukuamu, especially after the way he played last year down the stretch, coming in and playing some corner for them and really, frankly, doing a great job, doing better than just kind of replacement level. Mm-hmm. And I think that when we've seen him come in and play safety, he's been very good. He looks the part. He's made plays. He's shown that he's ready for it. So I feel like Mukuamu is a guy that, has moved kind of to some sort of middle rung between, those top three and the kind of the rest of the group, right? He's separated himself from the Markquese Bells and the Tyler Coyles and that sort of thing. So I think that he's a guy that they are going to try to find a way to get on the field. And whether it's giving Kearse a few less snaps, whether it's having packages where he comes in and he's the nickel back, I think that I would be surprised if Mukwame was relegated to just a rotational role here, like where that he comes in when somebody needs a blow. I tend to think that they'll try different things to do to get him on the field to see what he can do, not only just to develop him, but because he's developed at a point where they could use that athleticism and that length on the field pretty soon.
It's also, we're going into year 3 now with Israel Muhammad. We've talked about his potential forever. Like, it's time to use him, right? He's this really cheap asset. He's got this unique skill set with his length and his, quickness. You got to get him on the field and see if he can make the plays, because every time the Cowboys have given him opportunities, he's been awesome, whether it's in preseason where he led the NFL in interceptions, which I know doesn't mean anything, but you get him in the field in the regular season, he makes plays. In a playoff game, you have him play slot corner, and he's really good. It's time for the Cowboys to find ways to get him on the field. But I also want to mention a couple other players, actually 3 other players. Which is
there's a lot.
Absolutely insane. Markquese Bell, an undrafted free agent that the Cowboys gave a ton of money to last offseason. He was on the active roster all 17 games last year. That clearly means they like him quite a bit.
Yeah.
They also have Tyler Coyle, who I believe we're going into year 3 now. Remember, the Cowboys pulled him up off the practice squad late in the season to kind of play some slot corner for them. He's been somebody who's been on some of their special teams units. They like him quite a bit. And then Wanye Thomas, another undrafted free agent that they signed last year from Georgia Tech. Maybe not quite the athlete of Markquese Bell, but another one of these free safety types that maybe down the road could replace Malik Hooker. Just gave you 7 safeties to watch during training camp. And Landon, you remember the days when we were hoping to have maybe this is the year Gerald Sensabas, just a little bit more consistent.
I mean, we were trying to find a second safety, and now we have 3 safeties that are beyond starter level, and then 4 other guys who all look like solid replacements for each one of those 3. I mean, I don't even know what to do with myself.
Do you remember the days when Barry Church was a revelation for the Cowboys defense?
I mean, we don't have to go back that far. Honestly, just talking about Donovan Wilson, do you remember when all of our safety hopes pinned on whether Donovan Wilson was healthy that week or not?
I do.
That wasn't that long ago. So, I mean, the way the Cowboys were able to turn this position around is, I can't think of anything like it. I mean, it's seriously, and just the speed in which they were able to go from consistently one of the worst safety situations in the league to, like we said, arguably the best safety situation in the league is shocking. The speed in which the turnaround happened is unbelievable, frankly.
The drought in safeties between Ken Hamlin to Jayron Kearse was pretty incredible, right?
It really, really, really was. I mean, it rivaled the time between, what are we calling it, Danny White and Tony Romo, or I guess we'll call your guy what's his name as an interim quarterback. But it's one of those things where it's you just kind of had forgotten about it. You're just they'll patch up safety again this year. And then suddenly, they sign 2 free agents, and Cowboys Nation is so used to just this kind of behavior. They're like, it's not going to move the needle. Suddenly Hooker is the Hooker that you thought he was going to be. Yep. Kearse is some dude you'd never seen before. It suddenly showed up with the way he played on the Cowboys. And then Donovan Wilson, who had already been on a steady incline, kind of just filled out the room in a way that it just, like I said, it all just happened at once. It was very bizarre.
One of the reasons why I'm very optimistic about this Cowboys team this year is the secondary and the defensive line, really the edge rushers. They're filled with top end talent, and they've got a lot of depth. And those are 2 positions where you need to have the depth. I think over the course of a 17-game season, they're going to be able to manage these guys' snaps, find ways to use them in unique packages to get, different groups on the field. And together that should help them be a really successful defense, not only game to game, but over the course of the season. This defense should be absolutely awesome. And I think the safeties are going to be a big reason for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard not to be excited about this group. It's hard not to be excited about the group in front of them. One thing I really like about what you just said too is that, there's always constantly this struggle between pass rush and coverage. And because the Cowboys are deep at both positions, as injury or whatever happens throughout the season, they can adjust. They
Yeah.
can make adjustments like, oh, we're down a pass rusher, we may need to really tighten it up on coverage. Oh, we're down a corner, we may need to crank it up in the pass rush. And it gives the Cowboys opportunity to correct injury mistakes outside of just trying to plug in another corner or plug in another defensive
and not
end.
only that, like I think for the first time in forever, they have like some performance stuff. Like if somebody's just struggling, they have a 2-game stretch where they're not playing well. It's
They
not,
got a
hey, he's
guy.
got to work his way through it because we have no other option. Like I remember the days of, hey, your pass rushers are Jeremy Mincy and Everett Brown, and they got to figure it out one way or another. It's, hey, if you don't perform, you're just not going to get snaps, right? There's no more of this, just show up and play and collect your paycheck. Like you've got to earn your snaps at edge rusher and at safety. And that should just raise the floor and the ceiling for everybody in both units. That is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Cowboys your first listen of the day. Again, every day, we'll be back tomorrow to answer your Twitter questions. So make sure that you send them in. We are free and available on all platforms. Check out our show on YouTube. Go follow Landon on Twitter at McCoolBCB. I'm at Marcus_Mosher. We'll see you guys next time.